Men, when was the last time you cried? My number one dream in life was always to be a dad. Ever since I was a little kid, I dreamed of the day I'd be drinking coffee out of my father's day mug, reading my kids' bedtime stories, and throwing them in the air before giving them ice cream for dinner. That dream came true 5 years ago. My wife gave birth to a baby girl named Isabella. We spent that night by her side, singing off-key lullabies and changing her diapers. Every night I talked to Isabella about how lucky I was to have her, and how there's no ocean I wouldn't cross for her. Unfortunately, things turned sour very quickly. My wife developed postpartum, and it was bad. The doctors told us she might experience mood swings, but promised it wouldn't be much more than that. But within 8 months of Isabella being home, my wife began lashing out. Seemingly overnight, she became angry, erratic, borderline schizophrenic, and violent. She'd throw things, scream at Isabella for crying, curse me out. She tossed our picture frames against a wall and screamed she was going to cull Isabella, that this was all her fault. I remember giving her a double dose of sleeping pills without her knowing. It sounds bad, but I couldn't put Isabella in danger. The next day, the day Isabella nearly died, started at 7 a.m. when I sat my wife down. Please, let's see a doctor. I begged. I told her I loved her, but she needed help. My wife's eyes stayed stone cold. Before I knew it, she was shouting again, screaming that this was our daughter's fault, and that I loved Isabella more than I loved her. I tried to take her hand, but she bit me. She ran upstairs towards Isabella's room with a knife in her hand, and I had to physically push her down and run into the room myself. I locked it and held Isabella for hours while my wife stabbed and pounded at the door. By this point, Isabella was already traumatized. She barely responded to me. The silly faces she used to laugh at now resulted in empty stares. Her cries were quiet, scared whimpers. She wasn't the happy kid growing up in a warm, loving home I'd dreamed of. She was a scared, terrified girl who had stopped crying just to not give her mother a reason to yell. I remember feeling like a failure looking into her eyes that day while her mother banged on the door. I couldn't go on like this. I decided I was done, not just because my wife was banging on the door or because the police were coming, but also because Isabella spoke her first words that day. "Stop," she said. I was confused at first, but then it hit me. Throughout the first 8 months of her life, she'd heard me begging her mother to stop more times than she heard Mama or Dada. That's why she was saying stop. My heart shattered, but by the time police had arrived, my wife already looked like the victim. Once she realized officers were on their way, she'd bruised herself in the bathroom and told them I did it. They believed her and placed Isabella into her arms while I was led away in handcuffs. I screamed and resisted my whole way out, and it's only at the police station did I prove my innocence. You see, my wife didn't know about the cameras in Isabella's room, the ones I installed out of fear. It didn't take long for officers to see what had really happened. They gave my Isabella back to me, but by the time I got her, it was basically too late. There were red handprints on her back. Her legs were bruised. Her ribs were broken. Her mother had laid hands on her repeatedly. I took my baby to the hospital where they had to hook her up to machines. I used every dollar to my name to keep my baby alive. My wife went to prison for 7 years, which felt like a slap in the face. But Isabella got better. It took her a few months, but I finally brought her home. I used the little money I had left to rent a cheap one-bedroom apartment, and I thought this was it. We were finally free. Her mother couldn't bother us anymore. Then the 7 years my wife was imprisoned for passed. I'd spent those 7 years doing everything I could to make sure Isabella grew happy, and I did well. She went from being afraid to cry to bawling her eyes out when she needed a diaper change. Soon, she started hugging me and demanding cuddles. By the time she was attending school, she refused to sleep until I told her a story. And then came the day that changed everything. I came home from work on a random Wednesday to find her drawing. She told me to close my eyes and wait, and when she told me to open them, I burst into tears. It was me and her as stick figures, holding hands, with "Best Dad Ever, I Love You" written on top. I looked up at her, and her brown eyes sparkled. I scooped her into my arms and nuzzled her into my chest, trying to hold back tears, but I couldn't do it. I cried on her shoulder. She wiped my tears with her sleeve and told me if I was crying, she needed to cry too. She then burst into a dramatic fake cry that made me laugh. It was the best day of my life. Sadly, what followed was the worst day of my life, because not even a week later, her mother contacted me. She wanted Isabella and was taking me to court for full custody. The papers arrived 3 days later in a thin manila envelope that I almost threw away thinking it was junk mail. I sat at my kitchen table and pulled out the custody filing, and my hands started shaking so bad I could barely hold the pages. The words kept blurring together, but the meaning was clear as glass. Isabella's mother wanted her back. There was a court date set for 3 weeks from now. I looked over at Isabella in the living room, sprawled on her stomach with crayons scattered around her, drawing another picture of us holding hands. She had no idea that the monster from her baby years was trying to claw her way back into our lives. I folded the papers and shoved them in a drawer before Isabella could see them, then spent the rest of the evening pretending everything was normal while my stomach twisted into knots. After I tucked Isabella into bed that night and sang her favorite lullaby, I pulled out my laptop and started searching. I typed in family law, custody battles, postpartum psychosis, anything I could think of. Every article I read made me feel sicker. Courts favor reunification with both parents. Mothers often get preference in custody cases. 7 years is considered enough time for rehabilitation. I found forum after forum of fathers who lost custody despite being the better parent. By 3 a.m., I was still awake, scrolling through lawyer websites and legal advice pages, my eyes burning from staring at the screen. I had maybe $2,000 in my savings account after paying rent and Isabella's school supplies. Most of the lawyers I looked at wanted $5,000 just to start. I had no idea how I was going to afford this fight, but I knew I needed a lawyer immediately, or I'd lose her. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. My boss sounded annoyed, but I didn't care. I started calling every family law attorney in the county, working down a list I'd printed out. The first 5 wanted money for consultations. 3 more couldn't see me for weeks. 1 laughed when I explained my budget. By my 15th call, my voice was shaking, and I was ready to give up. Then a woman answered and said Gregory Mercer had a cancellation that afternoon if I could come in at 2. I almost cried with relief and told her I'd be there. Gregory's office was in an old building downtown with creaky floors and outdated furniture. He was in his late 50s with gray hair and kind eyes, but when he started talking about my case, his manner was blunt and direct, which I actually liked. He reviewed the custody filing while I sat across from him, my leg bouncing under the table. He didn't try to make me feel better with false hope. My ex-wife had completed her full sentence, participated in prison therapy programs, taken her medications consistently. Her lawyer was painting her as a success story, a woman who got sick and did the work to get better. Gregory said the retainer alone would be $5,000. If the case went to trial, he estimated it could cost $30,000 to $40,000 total. I felt like someone had punched me in the chest. I sat there in his office trying not to fall apart, explaining that I didn't have that kind of money, asking if there were payment plans or legal aid options or anything. Gregory looked at his wife, Sharon, who worked as his paralegal and had been taking notes the whole time. They exchanged one of those looks that married people have, the kind where they communicate without words. Then Gregory said they could take the case for $3,000 down and monthly payments after that. Sharon smiled at me gently and started filling out paperwork. I left their office with a tiny spark of hope in my chest, but I still had no idea where I'd find $3,000 by next week. That evening, after Isabella went to bed, I sat on my couch staring at my phone for 20 minutes before I finally called my older brother, Neil. We weren't close anymore, hadn't been for years after some stupid fight about money I'd borrowed and paid back late, but he was the only person I knew who might have that kind of cash. I explained everything in a rush, my voice breaking when I got to the part about how Isabella finally felt safe and happy after all these years. Neil didn't even pause to think about it. He said he'd wire $3,000 tomorrow morning and whatever else I needed for this fight. He said Isabella was family, and that's what family does. I had to put the phone down for a minute because I couldn't talk without crying. 2 days later, I met with Gregory and Sharon again to sign the retainer agreement and start building our case. They laid out the strategy at a conference table covered in legal pads and folders. My ex-wife's lawyer would argue she'd been rehabilitated through therapy and medication. We'd counter with Isabella's well-being and the severity of what happened 7 years ago. Gregory asked if I still had the video evidence from back then, the footage from the cameras I'd installed in Isabella's room. I told him I had copies stored in 3 different places because some part of me always knew this day might come. Gregory nodded like that made sense, then had Sharon start making a list of everything we'd need. He spent the next hour reviewing the original police reports, reading through medical records from when Isabella was in the hospital, watching the security footage on his laptop. His expression got darker as he went through it all. He said the evidence was powerful, but it was 7 years old. The judge would want to know about Isabella's current state and my ex-wife's current mental health. We needed recent documentation of Isabella's trauma responses. We needed expert testimony about the lasting effects of abuse on infants. We needed proof that my ex-wife still posed a danger despite all her certificates and therapy sessions. Sharon started making calls to set up evaluations, while Gregory explained what the next few weeks would look like. That night, I had to sit Isabella down for the hardest conversation of my life. She was playing with her stuffed rabbit on the couch when I asked her to come sit with me. I tried to explain in words a 7-year-old could understand that her mother wanted to see her again. Isabella's face went completely white. She asked in this tiny voice if the bad lady was coming back. I promised her I was fighting to keep her safe, that I wouldn't let anything happen to her, but I could see the fear flooding into her eyes, the same fear I'd worked so hard to help her overcome. I hated that I couldn't completely protect her from this nightmare. She didn't sleep that night, kept crawling into my bed saying she had bad dreams. The next week passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and sleepless nights. Gregory filed our response to the custody petition, arguing that any contact with the mother would be harmful to Isabella's psychological well-being. My ex-wife's lawyer fired back that I was being mean and trying to keep a changed woman from reuniting with her child. Documents flew back and forth between the lawyers. Then the judge's order came through. There would be a preliminary hearing in 2 weeks to assess the situation. The judge was also appointing a guardian ad litem, some guy named Paul Fitzpatrick, whose job was to investigate what would be best for Isabella. I read the order 3 times, trying to understand what it all meant, feeling like I was drowning in legal language and procedures I didn't understand. A few days later, I got a call from Paul Fitzpatrick asking to meet at a coffee shop near the courthouse. He was a quiet man in his 40s with gray hair and tired eyes that looked like they'd seen too many custody battles. We sat across from each other while he explained his job in simple terms. He represented Isabella's interests independently from both me and my ex-wife. He'd be interviewing both of us, spending time with Isabella, looking through all the records from 7 years ago, and then making recommendations to the judge about what he thought was best for her. I wanted to trust him, but my stomach twisted thinking about how he'd see all those certificates my ex-wife earned in prison, the therapy completion forms, the anger management classes, the mental health evaluations saying she was stable now. What if he looked at all that paperwork and decided she deserved a chance? What if he thought 7 years was enough time for someone to change? Paul told me he'd be visiting our apartment next Tuesday afternoon to observe how Isabella and I interacted. He asked me to have Isabella there and to just act normal, let her play and be herself. I agreed, but spent the next few days stressed about what normal even meant anymore. Tuesday came faster than I wanted. I took the afternoon off work and got home early to clean the apartment even though it was already clean. I moved toys around and then moved them back. Isabella asked why I was acting weird, and I told her someone was coming to visit who wanted to meet her. She got nervous immediately, asking if it was the bad lady. I promised her it wasn't, that it was just a man who wanted to see how happy we were together. When Paul knocked on the door at 2 o'clock, Isabella ran behind me and grabbed onto my leg. Paul came in carrying a briefcase and wearing a kind smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He crouched down to Isabella's level and asked her name, even though he obviously already knew it. She whispered it while hiding half her face behind my leg. Paul noticed her drawings on the fridge and asked about them. Isabella stayed quiet at first, but when he pointed to one of her stick figure pictures and said it looked like she was a good artist, she peeked out a little more. He asked if she had more drawings she could show him. She nodded and slowly walked to her room, looking back at me twice to make sure I was still there. She came back with a folder full of her artwork, and Paul sat on the floor with her while she showed him each one. He asked gentle questions about her school and her friends and what she liked to do for fun. Isabella started warming up, telling him about her teacher and the games she played at recess. Paul took notes in a small notebook, but did it casually, so it didn't seem scary. He watched how Isabella looked at me every few minutes for reassurance, and how I nodded at her to keep talking. After about an hour, Isabella got comfortable enough to go play with her stuffed animals in the corner, while Paul and I talked. He asked detailed questions about our daily routine. What time did Isabella wake up? What did we eat for breakfast? How did I get her ready for school? What did we do in the evenings? I answered everything honestly, describing how we had dinner together every night and how she wouldn't go to sleep until I read her a story. He asked about my support system, and I told him about Neil and how my brother had been there for us since the beginning. Paul wanted to know how I'd helped Isabella deal with what happened when she was a baby. I explained the therapy we'd done for 2 years and how I'd worked hard to make her feel safe every single day. He wrote everything down in his notebook, and I couldn't tell if he thought I was doing a good job or not. After 2 hours, Paul thanked us for our time and said he'd be in touch. Isabella waved goodbye from behind me, and the second the door closed, she asked if she did okay. I scooped her up and told her she was perfect. 2 days later, I was getting ready for work when I found a letter from my landlord in the mailbox. My hands shook as I opened it. The building was being sold and all tenants needed to move out in 60 days. I read the letter 3 times hoping I'd misunderstood, but the words stayed the same. I had to be out by the end of next month. The timing couldn't have been worse. I was already drowning in legal bills and barely making rent each month, and now I had to find a new apartment. I'd need first month's rent and a security deposit, which meant at least $3,000 I didn't have. I'd have to pack everything and move while fighting this custody battle and working full-time. I walked into the bathroom and closed the door and sat on the floor with my back against the tub. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I let myself cry. Not the quiet tears I'd shed before, but actual sobbing where I couldn't catch my breath. Everything felt like too much. The legal fees, the court dates, the fear of losing Isabella, and now this. It felt like the universe was conspiring against me, throwing obstacle after obstacle in my path just to see how much I could take before I broke. That evening my phone rang and Neil's name lit up the screen. I answered and tried to sound normal, but my voice cracked on the first word. Neil asked what was wrong and everything poured out. I told him about the eviction notice on top of the legal bills and the custody fight and how I didn't know what to do anymore. Neil stayed quiet while I talked, and when I finally stopped, he said he'd loan me whatever I needed for the move. I told him I was already in debt to him for the lawyer fees, and I didn't know how I'd ever pay him back. Neil's voice got firm in that older brother way, and he said I needed to stop worrying about money and focus on keeping Isabella safe. He told me he'd sell his house if that's what it took to protect his niece. I tried to argue, but he wouldn't hear it. He said family helps family, and Isabella was family, and that was the end of the discussion. He'd wire me money for the apartment deposit by tomorrow. I thanked him and hung up and sat there feeling grateful and guilty at the same time. The preliminary hearing arrived on a cold morning 2 weeks later. I put on the only suit I owned, which was too tight because I'd lost weight from stress. The jacket pulled across my shoulders and the pants felt loose around my waist. I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the exhausted man staring back. Neil came over early to stay with Isabella, so I wouldn't have to bring her to court. She hugged me extra tight before I left and made me promise I'd come back. I drove downtown and met Gregory outside the courthouse. He looked over my suit and didn't comment on how bad it fit. We walked inside together and went through security and headed to the family court wing. The hallway was full of people waiting for their cases to be called. Lawyers in expensive suits, parents who looked as scared as I felt, social workers carrying thick folders. When they called our case number, Gregory and I walked into the courtroom. My ex-wife was already sitting at the other table with her lawyer. I hadn't seen her in 7 years, and the change shocked me. She didn't look like the wild-eyed woman who'd tried to break down Isabella's door with a knife. Her hair was neat and pulled back. She wore a nice dress and sat with her hands folded. She looked calm and put together, and nothing like the person from my nightmares. Her lawyer was a sharp-looking woman in a gray suit who had a thick folder in front of her. The judge entered, and everyone stood. She was an older woman with white hair and glasses who looked tired of dealing with broken families. She told everyone to sit and asked the lawyers to present their cases. My ex-wife's lawyer went first. She stood and painted my ex-wife as a success story of rehabilitation. Someone who had worked incredibly hard over 7 years to address her mental health issues. Someone who had completed every therapy program the prison offered. Someone who took her medication religiously and attended group sessions and did everything asked of her. The lawyer opened the folder and pulled out certificates from anger management classes, completion forms from parenting courses, letters from prison counselors. She spread them across the table like proof that my ex-wife had transformed into someone new. The lawyer said my ex-wife deserved a chance to know her daughter and build a relationship with her. Gregory stood up when it was our turn, and his voice was steady and cold. He pulled out the medical records from when Isabella was 8 months old, the x-rays showing broken ribs, the photos of bruises covering her tiny body, the police report describing red handprints on her back. He described that day 7 years ago when my ex-wife grabbed a knife and tried to break into Isabella's room. He played portions of the security video I'd installed, and even though the judge's face stayed neutral, I saw her flinch when the audio caught my ex-wife screaming threats. Gregory called me to the stand, and I testified about holding Isabella for hours while her mother pounded on the door, about how Isabella's first word was stop because she'd heard me begging so many times. The judge listened and took notes and asked pointed questions. She wanted to know what treatment my ex-wife received in prison for her mental health. She asked about medication and therapy, and whether the postpartum psychosis was considered cured or just managed. My ex-wife's lawyer produced letters from prison psychologists saying she'd made remarkable progress and was no longer a danger. They used words like stable and remorseful and rehabilitated. Gregory argued that remarkable progress didn't mean Isabella would be safe, that managing mental illness wasn't the same as eliminating risk. The hearing lasted 3 hours, and by the end, my head pounded, and my suit felt even tighter. The judge looked at both lawyers and said she was ordering a full custody evaluation. A court-appointed psychologist named Dr. Heidi Singh would assess both parents and Isabella. The evaluation would take several weeks and include interviews and home visits and psychological testing. The judge also ordered supervised visitation to begin in 2 weeks, 1 hour per week at a family services office with a social worker present. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. Isabella would have to see her mother, the woman who broke her ribs and screamed that she'd kill her. Gregory leaned over and whispered that this was actually standard procedure and we could use Isabella's reactions during the visits as evidence. But I barely heard him, because all I could think about was telling Isabella she'd have to face her mother again. The judge set a date for the next hearing after the custody evaluation was complete, and dismissed us. My ex-wife looked over at me as we left, and I saw tears in her eyes, but I felt nothing except rage. I picked Isabella up from Neil's house and drove her home in silence. I kept trying to figure out how to tell her, and every version sounded terrible. That night after dinner, I asked her to sit with me on the couch. She climbed up next to me, holding her stuffed rabbit, and I tried to find words that wouldn't scare her. I told her the judge wanted her to see her mother for a little while each week, but that a nice lady would be there the whole time to keep her safe. Isabella's face went completely white. She asked in this tiny voice if the bad lady was coming back. I promised her I wouldn't let anything happen to her, but Isabella started screaming. She said she wouldn't go, that the bad lady would hurt her. She got so worked up she made herself throw up right there on the couch. I grabbed her and held her while she sobbed and shook. She threw up again on my shirt, but I didn't care. I just held her and rocked her back and forth like I used to when she was a baby. I felt like the worst father in the world because I couldn't protect her from this. She cried until she had no tears left, and then just made these horrible gasping sounds. I sang the lullabies I used to sing when she was little, and eventually she fell asleep in my arms. I carried her to bed and stayed next to her the whole night, listening to her whimper in her sleep. The next day, Isabella's teacher called me at work. Mrs. Tate said Isabella had a panic attack during class and couldn't calm down. She'd started crying and hyperventilating, and nothing the teacher did helped. They had to call me, but I was in a meeting and missed it, so they called the emergency contact, which was Neil. He'd gone to pick her up, but Miss Tate wanted to talk to me about what was going on. I left work early and went to the school. Mrs. Tate was a kind woman in her 30s who genuinely cared about her students. I sat in her classroom after the other kids left and explained the custody situation. I told her about my ex-wife and the abuse and the court battle. Mrs. Tate listened and immediately offered to write a letter for court describing how well-adjusted and happy Isabella had been all year. She said Isabella was one of her best students, always smiling and participating and getting along with the other kids. But then Mrs. Tate's expression changed, and she pulled out some of Isabella's recent artwork. The drawings were completely different from her usual style. Dark scribbles covered the pages, angry faces with sharp teeth, black and red marks that looked violent and chaotic. Mrs. Tate said this was totally unlike Isabella's normal cheerful drawings, and she was worried. I took the drawings home and felt sick looking at them. The first supervised visitation was scheduled for the following Wednesday at a family services office downtown. I had to bring Isabella there at 3 o'clock. The whole drive over, she sat silent in the back seat, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. Her knuckles were white from gripping it so hard. I kept looking at her in the rearview mirror, and her face was blank, like she'd shut down completely. We pulled into the parking lot of a plain brick building, and I had to unbuckle her seatbelt because she wouldn't move. I took her hand, and we walked inside where a social worker greeted us with a too bright smile. She was a young woman with a clipboard who tried to act cheerful, but I could see the pity in her eyes. She led us down a hallway to a small room with toys and chairs and a table. She told Isabella this was where she'd visit with her mother and that she'd be right there the whole time. Isabella's hand squeezed mine so hard it hurt. The social worker asked Isabella to sit at the table and she shook her head. She wrapped both arms around my leg and wouldn't let go. The social worker kept talking in that cheerful voice about how everything would be okay. Then the door opened and my ex-wife walked in. Isabella screamed, not a regular scream, but a sound of pure terror that made my blood run cold. She tried to run, but I was holding her, and the social worker moved to block the door. Isabella fought against me, kicking and crying and screaming that she wouldn't stay. The social worker had to physically pull Isabella's arms off my leg while my daughter begged me not to leave her. I tried to tell her it would be okay, but she couldn't hear me over her own screaming. The social worker pushed me toward the door, and I had no choice but to go. I stood in the hallway listening to Isabella's terrified sobs for an entire hour. My ex-wife tried talking to her through the door, but Isabella just cried harder. The social worker came out twice to tell me Isabella was calming down, but I could still hear her whimpering. When the hour finally ended, the door opened, and Isabella ran to me so fast she almost fell. She grabbed onto me and wouldn't let go. Her face was red and swollen from crying, and she was shaking. The social worker said the visit was difficult, but that these things take time. I wanted to scream at her that my daughter shouldn't have to go through this, but I just picked Isabella up and carried her out to the car. She didn't let go of me the entire drive home. I carried her inside, and she wouldn't let me put her down. She wrapped her legs around my waist and buried her face in my neck. I tried to make dinner, but she clung to me, so I ordered pizza with one hand while holding her with the other. She picked at 2 bites and then asked to go to bed even though it was only 6:30. I tucked her in and she grabbed my hand. I told her I'd be right outside her room, but she started crying again, so I lay down next to her. She fell asleep, holding onto my shirt. I stayed there for hours, watching her breathe and hoping this was the worst of it. Around midnight, I finally got up to use the bathroom and check my phone. Gregory had emailed asking how the visit went, and I didn't have the energy to respond. I crawled back into bed next to Isabella and tried to sleep. At 3 in the morning, I woke up to find her side of the bed empty and wet. My stomach dropped. She hadn't wet the bed since she was 2 years old. I found her in her closet, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, rocking back and forth. She didn't look at me when I opened the door. I sat down next to her in the small space and pulled her onto my lap. She was shaking and making small whimpering sounds. I started singing the lullabies I used to sing when she was a baby. The same ones I sang in the hospital when she was hooked up to machines. The same ones I sang every night for months after we finally came home. I watched 7 years of healing fall apart in front of me. All the progress we'd made. All the nights she'd slept peacefully. All the times she'd laughed and played without fear. Gone. I held her and sang until the sun came up. She finally fell asleep around 6, and I carried her to my bed since hers was still wet. I called in sick to work again and spent the day doing laundry and staying close to her. She didn't want to eat. She didn't want to play. She just wanted to sit next to me on the couch holding my hand. Thursday morning came and I had my appointment with Dr. Singh. Neil came over to watch Isabella because I couldn't bring her with me. Isabella cried when I tried to leave, and Neil had to distract her with cartoons while I slipped out. Dr. Singh's office was in a medical building downtown. The waiting room had boring paintings and old magazines. A woman called my name and led me back to a small office with 2 chairs and a desk. Dr. Singh was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes and a calm way of moving. She shook my hand and told me to sit down. She had a notebook and started asking questions about Isabella. How did I help her recover from the abuse? What was our daily routine like? How did Isabella do in the school? I answered everything as best I could. I told her about the years of therapy we did when Isabella was little, about the nightmares that slowly went away, about how she went from being too scared to cry to being a normal, happy kid. Dr. Singh took notes and nodded. She asked about my parenting approach, and I explained that I just tried to keep Isabella safe and loved, that I showed up for every school event and made sure she knew I'd always be there. The questions got harder. She asked how I felt about what happened 7 years ago. I told her the truth, that I felt like I failed Isabella by not getting her mother help sooner, that I should have seen how bad things were getting, that I blame myself for not protecting her better. Dr. Singh's face stayed neutral, but her voice was warm when she asked about my fears now. I told her I was scared the system would give my ex-wife another chance and Isabella would get hurt again, that I was terrified of losing my daughter to someone who already proved she was dangerous. Dr. Singh wrote more notes and said we'd talk again soon. The appointment lasted an hour, and I left feeling raw and exposed. A few days later, Isabella had her session with Dr. Singh. I drove her to the same office and sat in the waiting room while they talked. My leg bounced the whole time. I checked my phone every 2 minutes. I tried to read a magazine but couldn't focus on the words. After 45 minutes, the door opened and Isabella came out looking tired. Dr. Singh asked to speak with me privately and had Isabella wait with the receptionist. We went back to her office and she closed the door. She told me Isabella was clearly dealing with trauma, that she showed a lot of anxiety when they talked about her mother, that her reactions were consistent with a child who'd been abused. I already knew all this, but hearing it from a professional made it more real. Dr. Singh asked if Isabella was currently in therapy. I had to admit that we'd done therapy for 2 years after the abuse, but I'd stopped taking her because I couldn't afford it anymore. The sessions were expensive and my insurance barely covered anything. Dr. Singh's face got serious. She said Isabella needed to be back in therapy immediately, that what she was going through with the custody battle was making her old trauma worse. She wrote down a name and number on a piece of paper. A colleague who worked with childhood trauma and offered a sliding scale based on income. I took the paper and thanked her. My hands were shaking as I folded it and put it in my pocket. I called the number that afternoon and got an appointment for the next week. The therapist's office was in an old house that had been converted into medical suites. I filled out paperwork in the waiting room while Isabella colored. The therapist came out to get us. She was an older woman with gray hair and a soft voice. She introduced herself and shook Isabella's hand gently. The first session was mostly just her talking with Isabella and me together, getting to know us, asking basic questions. At the end, she explained her rates. Even with the sliding scale, it was $80 per session. She recommended weekly sessions, which meant $320 a month. I did the math in my head while she talked. Gregory's payment plan was $500 a month. Rent was $900. The eviction meant I'd need to find a new place soon, which meant first month and security deposit. I was already working every overtime shift I could get. I made maybe $3,000 a month before taxes. The numbers didn't work. But I looked at Isabella sitting in the chair swinging her legs, and I knew I didn't have a choice. I told the therapist we'd be back next week and scheduled the appointment. On the drive home, I called Neil and asked if I could borrow another $2,000. He said yes, without asking why. The second supervised visitation happened the following Wednesday. I drove Isabella to the same building and she didn't scream this time. She just got very quiet and still. The social worker met us in the lobby and tried to talk to Isabella, but she didn't respond. We walked to the same room as before. My ex-wife was already sitting at the table. Isabella's whole body went stiff when she saw her. The social worker took Isabella's hand and led her to a chair. I had to leave again. I stood in the hallway for an hour listening to nothing. No screaming, no crying, just silence, which somehow felt worse. When the door opened, Isabella walked out like a robot. Her face was blank. Her eyes looked empty. She didn't run to me this time. She just walked slowly and took my hand. The social worker pulled me aside and said the visit went better, that Isabella sat quietly the whole time, but I could see in her eyes that she knew something was wrong. In the car, Isabella stared out the window and didn't say anything. That night she had nightmares, and I woke up 3 times to find her standing next to my bed crying. A week later, Gregory called and said he'd received my ex-wife's psychological evaluation from her current therapist. He emailed me a copy, and I read it on my lunch break at work. My hands clenched around my phone as I read the words. The therapist described my ex-wife as insightful and remorseful, said she'd done excellent work in therapy, and showed real commitment to her recovery. There was a section about her postpartum psychosis diagnosis, about how severe it was and how it explained her actions. But most of the evaluation focused on how much she'd improved, how stable she was on medication, how she'd completed anger management and parenting classes in prison. The last paragraph recommended gradual reunification with appropriate safeguards, said my ex-wife deserved a chance to rebuild a relationship with her daughter. I wanted to throw my phone across the room. I wanted to scream that no amount of therapy classes erased what she did, that Isabella still had nightmares about her, that she'd broken our baby's ribs and left scars that would never fully heal. But I just sat there in my car in the parking lot, shaking with anger. That weekend, I started packing boxes for our move. Neil came over Saturday morning to help. I was in Isabella's room wrapping her toys in newspaper when he found me sitting on the floor. I had a box of her baby things in front of me. The tiny clothes she wore when we finally brought her home from the hospital. The blanket with yellow ducks that I wrapped her in while her mother pounded on the locked door. A stuffed elephant she used to sleep with when she was too scared to close her eyes. Neil sat down next to me without saying anything. We just sat there for a while, 2 brothers who both understood that sometimes there are no words for this kind of fear and anger. Eventually, he put his hand on my shoulder, and we kept packing. The actual move happened the next Saturday, and it rained the whole day. Neil brought 2 of his friends, and we loaded everything into a truck. Isabella was anxious about the whole thing. She kept asking if her mother would know where we were going, if the bad lady could find our new address. I promised her that only safe people knew where we lived now, though I wasn't sure that was true since court records were public. Our new apartment was in a worse neighborhood than our old one. Smaller too, but it was what I could afford on my salary with all the legal bills. The one good thing was, Isabella got her own tiny bedroom instead of having to share mine. We spent the afternoon unpacking boxes and trying to make the place feel like home. Isabella arranged her stuffed animals on her bed and hung up the drawing she'd made me, the one with the stick figures and the words about me being the best dad. I helped her put up some glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling. By bedtime, she seemed a little better about the move. The therapy sessions over the next few weeks showed just how bad things were. Isabella's new therapist told me about the nightmares Isabella described, about her anxiety over being separated from me, about behaviors she'd mastered years ago that were coming back, clinging to me constantly, scared to be alone, trouble sleeping. The therapist explained that the custody battle was bringing up all of Isabella's early trauma, that being forced to see her mother was basically traumatizing her all over again. She said she was going to write a detailed letter for the court, one that explained how contact with her mother was causing real psychological harm, one that recommended the visits be stopped until the custody case was decided. I thanked her and felt a tiny bit of hope that maybe someone in the system would actually listen. A few weeks after that, Gregory called with news about Dr. Singh's evaluation of my ex-wife. I wasn't allowed to be there for it, obviously, but Gregory told me how it went. My ex-wife had apparently presented very well, calm and articulate. She'd cried when talking about what she did to Isabella, said her mental illness had made her into a different person back then, that she wasn't that person anymore. Gregory said Dr. Singh's preliminary notes indicated she found my ex-wife's remorse genuine. Those words made my blood run cold. Genuine remorse. Like that mattered. Like being sorry made Isabella safe. I thanked Gregory for the update and hung up. Then I sat on my couch in our small apartment and put my head in my hands. Genuine remorse didn't mean Isabella wouldn't get hurt again. It just meant my ex-wife had learned how to say the right things to the right people. The third visit came 2 weeks later, and I knew it would be bad the moment Isabella woke up that morning. She barely touched her breakfast and kept asking if we really had to go. I tried to stay calm and positive, but my stomach was twisted in knots, watching her get more and more anxious as we got ready to leave. We got in the car around 9 and started the drive to the Family Services office downtown. About halfway there, Isabella started breathing funny, fast and shallow like she couldn't get enough air. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her face had gone pale and sweaty. I asked if she was okay, but she just shook her head and made this small, whimpering sound. Then she threw up all over herself in the back seat. I pulled over immediately and helped her out of the car. She was shaking and crying, and I cleaned her up as best I could with the napkins I had in the glove box. I called the Family Services office and told them we'd be late because Isabella was sick. They said to come anyway since the visit was already scheduled. We got back in the car, and I drove the rest of the way with Isabella crying quietly in the back. When we pulled into the parking lot, she started hyperventilating, really bad gasping breaths like she was drowning. I unbuckled my seatbelt and turned around to try to calm her down, but she grabbed onto her seatbelt and wouldn't let go. The social worker came out to the parking lot after 10 minutes and tapped on my window. I rolled it down, and she leaned in to look at Isabella. She tried talking to Isabella in this gentle voice, asking her to come inside, but Isabella just kept hyperventilating and shaking her head. The social worker asked if she could open the back door, and I said yes. She opened it and crouched down next to Isabella, trying to get her to calm down and breathe slowly. But Isabella's breathing got worse, and she started making this horrible panicked sound. After 30 minutes of this, the social worker finally said they'd have to cancel the visit. She told me to take Isabella home and that she'd note in her report that Isabella experienced extreme distress. I thanked her and drove home with Isabella still crying in the back seat. 3 days later, I got a notice in the mail from the court. My ex-wife's lawyer had filed a motion claiming I was coaching Isabella to act afraid. They said I was doing parental alienation and turning Isabella against her mother on purpose. They wanted the judge to order me to encourage the relationship and stop interfering with visits. I read the motion twice and felt this rage building in my chest that made my hands shake. My daughter had thrown up from anxiety and hyperventilated so bad she couldn't breathe, and they were saying I caused it. I called Gregory immediately, and he could probably hear the anger in my voice. He told me to calm down, and that this was a common tactic from the other side. He said Isabella's therapist letter and the social worker's observations would prove that Isabella's fear was real trauma, not something I planted in her head. He promised he'd file a response, and that the evidence was on our side. I hung up feeling slightly better, but still so angry I wanted to punch something. Work was falling apart around the same time. I'd used up all my sick days and vacation time for court dates and therapy appointments and evaluation meetings. My boss called me into his office on a Thursday afternoon and closed the door. He sat down across from me and said he needed to talk about my performance and attendance. I could see the concern on his face, but also the frustration. He said I'd been late 6 times in the past month and had left early at least 4 times. My work quality had dropped, and I seemed distracted all the time. I tried to explain about the custody battle as briefly as I could without going into all the details. He listened and nodded and said he understood I was going through something difficult. But then he said the company could only be flexible for so long. He needed me to be reliable or he'd have to start writing me up. I promised I'd do better and left his office feeling sick. The thought of losing my job on top of everything else kept me awake that night, and the next night, and the night after that. I'd lie in bed doing math in my head about how long I could pay rent and Gregory's fees if I got fired. Paul's report came in mid-October, and Gregory called me to say he'd gotten a copy. He asked me to come by his office that afternoon to go over it. I left work early again and drove to Gregory's office building. Sharon let me in, and Gregory had the report spread out on his desk. He told me to sit down and said the report was actually good news. Paul recommended that primary custody stay with me. He noted my ex-wife's apparent rehabilitation, but said he had concerns about Isabella's severe trauma responses. He suggested supervised visitation should continue with more therapy support for Isabella. Gregory said it wasn't a complete victory since Paul didn't recommend stopping visits entirely, but he said it was actually a strong report given that Paul could have recommended reunification or shared custody instead. I read through the report myself and felt this weird mix of relief and disappointment. Relief that Paul saw I was the better parent. Disappointment that he still thought Isabella should keep seeing her mother. I thanked Gregory and drove home trying to focus on the positive parts. Dr. Singh finished her evaluation a week later and scheduled a feedback session with Gregory and me. We met at her office on a Tuesday morning. She had this thick folder of notes and test results spread out in front of her. She explained that my ex-wife had made progress with her mental health treatment, but she said Isabella's psychological well-being had to be the priority in custody decisions. She walked us through her evaluation findings and said I'd been an exemplary parent who helped Isabella heal significantly over the past 7 years. She said disrupting our current custody arrangement would be harmful to Isabella, but then she said she was recommending continued supervised visitation with intensive therapy for Isabella to process her fears. I felt my chest get tight hearing that. Gregory asked some follow-up questions about the therapy recommendations, and Dr. Singh explained her reasoning. I sat there nodding and trying to look like I understood, but inside I felt defeated. Another expert saying Isabella needed to keep seeing her mother. Another person who thought therapy could fix trauma caused by forced contact with an abuser. That night, I went to check on Isabella before bed and found her sitting on her bed holding that drawing she'd made months ago. The stick figures of us with "Best Dad Ever, I Love You" written on top. She looked up at me with these big, scared eyes and asked in this tiny voice if the judge was going to make her live with her mother. I sat down next to her and pulled her close. I promised her I was fighting with everything I had to keep her safe. I told her about Paul's report and Dr. Singh's evaluation and how they both said she should stay with me, but I could see in her eyes that she knew I couldn't guarantee anything. She asked what would happen if the judge didn't listen. I didn't have a good answer for that. I just held her and told her I wouldn't let anyone take her away from me. She fell asleep in my arms, and I carried her to her bed and tucked her in. Then I went to my room and stared at the ceiling for hours. 2 weeks later, Gregory called with bad news. My ex-wife's lawyer had filed another motion requesting a modification to the visitation schedule. They wanted unsupervised visits at a neutral location like a park or restaurant. Gregory said he was filing an objection immediately, citing Isabella's ongoing trauma responses and Dr. Singh's recommendations. But the judge had already scheduled a hearing to address the visitation issue. That meant another court appearance in 3 weeks. Another day off work? Another legal bill? Gregory told me his fees so far, and I felt sick. I was over $20,000 in debt between what I owed him and what I owed Neil. I had no idea when or how I'd ever pay it all back. I thanked Gregory and hung up and sat on my couch staring at the wall. The next day, Isabella's teacher sent home a note asking for a parent-teacher conference. I met with her after school the following week. She was kind, but clearly worried. She showed me Isabella's recent schoolwork, and it was bad. Assignments left incomplete, coloring that was just distracted scribbles, and that same disturbing dark scribbling I'd seen before. She said Isabella's academic performance had dropped significantly. She used to be one of the top students, but now she was falling behind. She'd also become withdrawn with her classmates and spent most of recess sitting alone. Mrs. Tate said she was concerned and suggested Isabella might benefit from a reduced schedule or even homeschooling until the custody situation stabilized. I explained that I couldn't afford to quit my job or pay for childcare. She nodded like she understood, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She said she'd do what she could to support Isabella at the school, but that Isabella clearly needed more help than school could provide. The visitation hearing happened on a cold morning in late November. The courthouse was freezing, and I sat next to Gregory watching people file in. Isabella's therapist testified first. She explained the psychological harm caused by maternal contact and described Isabella's regression and trauma symptoms in detail. The social worker went next and described Isabella's panic attacks and dissociative episodes during visits. She talked about the canceled third visit and how Isabella had hyperventilated in the car. My ex-wife's lawyer argued that Isabella just needed time to adjust. He said suspending visitation would make reunification harder later. He claimed that with proper therapeutic support, Isabella would eventually feel comfortable with her mother. The judge listened to everything and looked tired and frustrated. She asked a few questions about the therapy recommendations and the timeline for improvement. Then she announced her ruling. Supervised visitation would continue, but only twice monthly instead of weekly. Isabella would have mandatory therapy before and after each visit. I felt my shoulders drop hearing that. It was better than weekly visits, but it wasn't the complete stop I'd hoped for. I drove home feeling defeated instead of relieved. That night, Neil came over with pizza and found me sitting on the couch staring at the wall. Isabella was already asleep in her room. Neil sat down next to me and asked what I needed. I told him the truth. I needed this to be over. I needed someone to see that my daughter was tortured by this process. I needed the system to protect her instead of giving her abuser more chances. Neil put his hand on my shoulder and didn't say anything for a while. Then he told me to hang in there, that we'd get through this together, that Isabella was lucky to have me fighting for her. I wanted to believe him, but I was so tired I could barely think straight. December came fast, and Gregory called me into his office to go over the final hearing schedule. Mid-January was the date, and he spread papers across his desk, showing me the witness list and exhibits we'd be presenting. Sharon sat next to him with 3 thick binders full of organized evidence. Gregory explained the hearing would take 2 full days minimum. First day would be my ex-wife's case with her witnesses and testimony. Second day would be ours. He walked me through what I'd need to testify about, and I felt sick thinking about reliving that day in front of a judge. Sharon pulled out a practice sheet with potential questions the other lawyer might ask me. Gregory said there was a chance the judge would want to talk to Isabella privately in chambers, and my stomach dropped hearing that. I asked if Isabella would have to see her mother in the courtroom, and Gregory nodded. He said Isabella wouldn't testify, but she might be present for parts of it. I drove home feeling the weight of what was coming and found Isabella drawing at the kitchen table. She looked up at me with those brown eyes and asked if everything was okay. I told her it would be. Christmas shopping happened in between work shifts and legal prep sessions. I bought Isabella the art supplies she'd been asking for and a new stuffed animal that looked like her favorite rabbit. Neil offered to host Christmas dinner at his place so Isabella could play with her cousins, but I could see the anxiety in her face when I mentioned it. She asked me 3 times if this was our last Christmas together. Each time I promised her it wasn't, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. Christmas morning, she opened her presents slowly, like she was trying to make the day last forever. We drove to Neil's house around noon, and his wife had cooked enough food for 20 people. Isabella sat close to me the whole time and barely touched her plate. Neil's kids tried to get her to play, but she just watched them from the couch. I caught Neil's eye across the room, and he gave me this look that said he understood. After dinner, Isabella asked if we could go home early. We left before dessert, and she fell asleep in the car holding her new rabbit. That night, I tucked her in, and she grabbed my hand. She asked if her mother was going to take her away, and I promised I wouldn't let that happen. I sat on the floor next to her bed until she fell asleep because she wouldn't let go of my hand. The letter came 2 days after Christmas. Gregory called me at work and said my ex-wife's lawyer had sent a formal request for phone calls with Isabella. They wanted supervised phone contact twice a week, leading up to the hearing. Gregory's voice was firm when he told me to refuse. He said, given Isabella's trauma responses and the therapist's recommendations, there was no way he'd advise allowing it. But hearing about the request made me feel sick anyway. I thought about my ex-wife somewhere in an apartment or house writing this letter or telling her lawyer to send it. Maybe she actually believed she'd changed and deserved to talk to Isabella. Maybe she'd convinced herself that 7 years in prison and some therapy sessions erased what she did. I had to remind myself that believing you've changed doesn't make you safe. That night, I sat on my couch staring at nothing, and Neil texted asking if I was okay. I didn't respond because I didn't know how to put into words what I was feeling. Isabella's therapy session the next week changed everything. Her therapist called me in after the appointment, and her face was serious, but not worried. She explained that Isabella had finally been able to talk about her memories of the abuse in detail. Broken images of her mother's angry face, the feeling of being hurt, the sound of me begging her mother to stop. The therapist said she'd handled it carefully, but Isabella's memories were more intact than anyone realized. She told me this was actually validating because it proved Isabella's fear wasn't something I'd planted in her head. It was real trauma from real events that Isabella actually remembered, even though she'd been so young. The therapist said she'd write an updated letter for court, making it clear that Isabella's fear was rooted in actual traumatic memory and not parental alienation. I thanked her and drove Isabella home in silence. That night, Isabella was quiet during dinner and went to bed early without asking for a story. The week before the hearing, I barely slept. Gregory had me come to his office every evening after work to practice my testimony. He'd ask me questions, and I'd answer them while he took notes on what I said and how I said it. Sharon recorded some of the practice sessions so I could watch myself and see where I looked nervous or unsure. I gathered every piece of documentation I could find that proved I'd been a good father. Attendance records from every school event Isabella had, photos from birthday parties and holidays, letters from Miss Tate and other teachers, notes from neighbors. Sharon helped me organize everything into binders with tabs and labels. I watched her put together 7 years of my life with Isabella into neat plastic sleeves and felt something break inside me. My entire relationship with my daughter reduced to evidence and exhibits that had to prove I deserved to keep her. Raul called me out of nowhere on a Tuesday. He said Gregory had contacted him about testifying and he wanted to help. Raul had moved 2 hours away, but he drove in that Saturday to meet with Gregory and go over what he remembered. I met them at Gregory's office, and Raul looked older than I remembered. He shook my hand and told me he was sorry this was happening. Gregory walked him through the questions he'd ask on the stand and what the other lawyer might try to get him to say. Raul described what he'd witnessed 7 years ago in detail: the screaming, the sounds of things breaking, the day the police came. He said he was haunted by the sounds of my ex-wife yelling and Isabella crying. He told me he wished he'd called the police sooner and maybe none of this would be happening now. I thanked him for being willing to testify, and he said it was the least he could do. He had to take a day off work and drive 4 hours round trip, but he didn't complain once. After he left, Gregory told me Raoul's testimony would be powerful because he had nothing to gain from helping us. The night before the hearing, I could barely function. I picked Isabella up from the school and took her home where we had mac and cheese for dinner. Bath time took forever because she kept asking questions about tomorrow. I told her she didn't have to go to court, and she seemed relieved. After I got her in pajamas, she asked me to tell her a story like when she was little. I sat on the edge of her bed and made up a tale about a brave little girl and her father who had to fight a dragon together. The dragon was big and scary, but they weren't afraid because their love made them strong. They fought the dragon with courage and kindness, and in the end, they won because they had each other. Isabella smiled for the first time in days and asked if we were like the girl and her father. I told her we were exactly like them. She fell asleep holding my hand, and I sat there watching her breathe. I memorized her face and the way her hair fell across the pillow. I memorized the sound of her breathing and the weight of her small hand in mine. I stayed there until my back hurt from sitting in the same position because I didn't know if this was one of our last normal nights together. The custody hearing started on a gray January morning that felt colder than it should have been. I put on my too-tight suit and drove to the courthouse downtown. Gregory met me in the lobby, and we went through security together. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that buzzed. My ex-wife sat at the other table with her lawyer, and she looked nothing like the wild woman from 7 years ago. She wore a nice dress and had her hair pulled back. She looked nervous, but calm. The judge entered and everyone stood up. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and glasses. She explained the procedure in a flat voice and told both lawyers to begin. My ex-wife's lawyer stood up and called his first witness. The prison therapist walked to the stand and got sworn in. She testified about my ex-wife's progress in therapy and the work she'd done on herself. She talked about group sessions and individual counseling and behavior modification. The therapist said my ex-wife had shown remarkable growth and genuine remorse for her actions. Next came my ex-wife's current psychiatrist, who described her medication regimen in detail. He listed off pills and dosages and explained how they managed her condition. He said she'd been stable for over a year, with no incidents. The third witness was someone who knew my ex-wife before the abuse. This woman testified that my ex-wife was kind and caring back then, and claimed she'd returned to her old self. She talked about phone calls and visits, where my ex-wife seemed happy and healthy. Gregory stood up for cross-examination, and his questions were careful and pointed. He got the prison therapist to admit she'd never actually observed my ex-wife interact with children. He asked if she could guarantee my ex-wife wouldn't have another episode, and the therapist said no one could guarantee that. Gregory questioned the psychiatrist about whether mental illness could be cured or just managed. The psychiatrist admitted it could only be managed with ongoing treatment and medication. During the character witness testimony, Gregory established that this woman hadn't spent significant time with my ex-wife since her release, just brief visits and phone calls every few weeks. He asked how she could know my ex-wife had really changed based on such limited contact, and the woman stumbled over her answer. I watched the judge taking notes and tried to read her face, but she stayed neutral the whole time. Her pen moved across the paper, but her expression never changed. My ex-wife took the stand after lunch, and I had to sit there watching her cry. Her lawyer asked her to describe what happened 7 years ago, and she talked about it like something that happened to her instead of something she did. She said postpartum psychosis stole her mind and made her hurt the baby she loved. The words came out between sobs, and she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She claimed she thought about Isabella every single day in prison and worked hard to become someone worthy of being her mother. Her lawyer asked if she understood the harm she caused, and she said yes through tears. She said that's exactly why she wanted the chance to make amends and build a relationship with her daughter. She talked about the therapy and the medication and the work she'd done to heal herself. She said she'd never forgive herself for what happened, but hoped Isabella might someday forgive her. I felt my hands shaking under the table and had to focus on breathing steady. Gregory leaned over and whispered that her testimony was expected and we'd handle it tomorrow. The judge called a recess for the day, and everyone stood up as she left. My ex-wife looked at me across the courtroom and I looked away. I couldn't stand to see her face for one more second. Gregory stood up for his cross-examination, and I watched him approach my ex-wife with a folder in his hand. He started with simple questions about the day Isabella nearly died. He asked her to describe what happened, and she repeated the same story about being confused and scared. Then he opened the folder and pulled out the police report from 7 years ago. He read her statement to the officers where she claimed I was the one who hurt Isabella, He asked if she remembered saying that, and she nodded. He asked her to speak up for the record, and she said yes in a quiet voice. Gregory asked why she lied to the police, and she said she was having a mental breakdown and didn't know what she was doing. He asked if she understood that lying to police about child abuse was a serious crime, and she said yes. Then he pulled out the medical records showing Isabella's broken ribs and asked if she remembered breaking them. My ex-wife started crying and said she didn't remember doing it, but she knew she must have. Gregory asked how many times she hit Isabella that day, and she said she didn't know. He asked if it was more than once, and she whispered yes. He asked if it was more than 5 times, and she said she couldn't remember. Gregory's voice stayed calm, but his questions got sharper. He asked about the knife and whether she intended to hurt Isabella when she tried to break down the door. She said no, she just wanted to get into the room. He asked why she needed a knife to get into a room, and she didn't have an answer. Then Gregory pulled out her prison disciplinary record and asked about the 3 incidents of aggressive behavior. She said those were different situations where other inmates provoked her. He asked if she hit another inmate during the first incident, and she admitted she did. He asked about the second incident where she threw a food tray, and she said someone had insulted her. Gregory asked if she still got angry when people upset her, and she said she was working on it in therapy. He asked if her medication always kept her stable, and she said mostly. He pressed her on what mostly meant, and she said sometimes she still had bad days. By the time Gregory finished, my ex-wife was crying hard, and her lawyer kept passing her tissues. The judge called a recess, and everyone stood up. I walked out into the hallway and leaned against the wall. My hands were shaking, and I felt sick to my stomach. Gregory came over and told me the cross-examination went well. He said my ex-wife's admissions about the prison incidents and still having bad days would help our case. Sharon brought me a bottle of water, and I drank half of it in one go. The judge came back 15 minutes later, and my ex-wife's lawyer said he had no more witnesses. The judge looked at the clock and said we'd reconvene tomorrow morning for our side to present. I gathered my things and walked out to my car. The drive home took forever, even though it was only 20 minutes. Traffic was heavy, and I sat at red lights, staring at nothing. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex, I saw Neil's car parked in a visitor spot. I went upstairs and found him in my living room with Isabella. She was coloring at the coffee table and looked up when I came in. She asked if the bad lady was gone yet, and I sat down next to her. I told her we were still working on it, and the judge needed more time to decide. Isabella's face fell, and she asked if I told the judge that she didn't want to see her mother. I promised her that everyone knew how she felt. She asked if the judge would make her live with the bad lady, and I said I was doing everything I could to keep her safe. Neil suggested we order pizza for dinner, and Isabella perked up a little. We ate on the couch and watched a kids' movie, but I couldn't focus on it. My mind kept replaying my ex-wife's testimony and Gregory's questions. After Isabella fell asleep, Neil asked how I was holding up. I told him I felt like I was going to throw up and couldn't stop thinking about tomorrow. He said, I just needed to tell the truth, and the judge would see that Isabella belonged with me. I wanted to believe him, but I'd learned that the system didn't always do what made sense. The next morning, I dropped Isabella at Neil's house early and drove to the courthouse. Gregory met me outside, and we went over my testimony one more time. He said to stay calm, answer the questions directly, and don't let the other lawyer get under my skin. We went inside and waited for the judge. When she came in, Gregory stood up and called Isabella's therapist as our first witness. The therapist took the oath and sat down in the witness chair. Gregory asked her to describe Isabella's trauma symptoms, and she talked about nightmares, anxiety, and fear responses. She said Isabella had been doing well before the custody battle started, but regressed significantly once visitation began. Gregory asked what she meant by regressed, and the therapist explained that Isabella started wetting the bed again and having panic attacks. She said Isabella's fear of her mother was rooted in real traumatic memories from infancy. The therapist described how forcing contact with the source of trauma was re-traumatizing Isabella and causing psychological harm. My ex-wife's lawyer stood up for cross-examination and asked if therapy could help Isabella overcome her fear. The therapist said that would require removing the source of trauma first. He asked if children sometimes needed help accepting difficult situations, and she said this wasn't about acceptance. She stated firmly that Isabella's well-being required protection from her mother, not forced contact. The lawyer sat down looking frustrated. Gregory called Dr. Singh next, and she walked to the witness stand carrying a thick folder. She described her evaluation process and said she'd spent time with both parents and Isabella. Gregory asked for her findings, and she said I was a devoted, capable parent who consistently prioritized Isabella's needs. She said my ex-wife showed signs of progress, but still had risk factors that concerned her. Dr. Singh explained that while reunification was sometimes appropriate, Isabella's severe trauma responses indicated maternal contact was currently harmful. She recommended I retain primary custody with the possibility of revisiting visitation in several years. She said this should only happen if Isabella's therapy progressed, and she expressed willingness for contact herself. My ex-wife's lawyer asked Dr. Singh if she thought people could change, and she said yes, but change didn't erase past harm or current risk. He asked if denying a mother access to her child was fair, and Dr. Singh said fairness to adults wasn't her concern. She said her job was protecting Isabella's psychological health, and that required maintaining current custody arrangements. Gregory called Miss Tate after Dr. Singh stepped down. Isabella's teacher described her as a happy, well-adjusted student until the custody battle began. She brought Isabella's artwork to show the judge and explained how the drawings changed. The early ones showed bright colors and smiling stick figures. The recent ones were dark scribbles with angry faces. Miss Tate said Isabella's academic performance had declined and she'd become withdrawn from classmates. She described Isabella crying at the school and having trouble concentrating. My ex-wife's lawyer asked if other things could cause these changes besides the custody situation. Miss Tate said she'd taught for 15 years and knew what trauma looked like in children. She said the timing was too obvious to ignore, and Isabella had specifically mentioned being scared of seeing her mother. Raul took the stand next, and I felt grateful he'd made the drive. Gregory asked him to describe what he witnessed 7 years ago. Raul talked about hearing my ex-wife screaming through the walls and the sounds of things breaking. He said he heard her threaten Isabella multiple times. He described seeing me during that period looking exhausted and terrified. He said he watched me leave every morning with Isabella, while my ex-wife stayed inside. Raul testified about the day the police came and seeing my ex-wife in handcuffs. My ex-wife's lawyer asked if Raul had actually seen any abuse happen, and he admitted he hadn't. But he said the sounds and my appearance told him enough about what was going on. The lawyer tried to suggest Raul was biased because we were friends, but Raul said we were just neighbors who occasionally talked. He said he was testifying because he remembered what he saw and heard, not because of any friendship. Gregory called me to the stand, and my legs felt weak walking up there. I took the oath and sat down. Gregory started by asking how I met my ex-wife, and I described falling in love and getting married. He asked about Isabella's birth, and I talked about how happy we were that first night in the hospital. Then he asked when things changed, and I described my ex-wife's rapid deterioration after we brought Isabella home. I talked about the screaming and the violence and how scared I was for Isabella. Gregory asked me to describe the day Isabella nearly died, and I took a deep breath. I told the judge about sitting my wife down that morning and begging her to see a doctor. I described her running upstairs with a knife and me pushing her down to get into Isabella's room first. I talked about locking the door and holding Isabella for hours while her mother pounded and stabbed at the door from outside. Gregory asked about Isabella's first word, and I had to stop for a second because my voice was shaking. I told the judge that Isabella said stop because she'd heard me begging her mother to stop so many times. I said that was the moment I knew I'd failed to protect my daughter soon enough. Gregory asked about the 7 years since, and I described every bedtime story and scraped knee and parent-teacher conference. I talked about building a life where Isabella felt safe and loved. I said she finally smiled again and laughed again and became the happy kid I'd always dreamed of raising. My ex-wife's lawyer stood up for cross-examination, and his first question accused me of exaggerating the abuse. He suggested I was trying to keep Isabella from her mother out of spite. I said I had video evidence and medical records that proved every word I'd said. He asked if I'd ever encouraged Isabella to fear her mother, and I said no. I explained that Isabella's fear came from her own traumatic memories and the current forced contact. He asked if I thought my ex-wife deserved any chance at redemption, and I paused. I said redemption was between her and whatever God she believed in. But redemption didn't require access to the child she abused. He asked if I'd ever considered that Isabella might benefit from having a mother in her life. I said Isabella had aunts and teachers and other women who cared about her. She didn't need the one woman who'd broken her ribs when she was a baby. The lawyer looked angry but sat down. The judge cleared her throat and said she wanted to speak with Isabella privately in chambers. My heart dropped into my stomach. Gregory had warned me this might happen, but I still wasn't ready for it. Paul stood up and said he'd accompany Isabella as her guardian. The judge called a 30-minute recess while someone went to get Isabella from Neil's house. I went out to the hallway and paced back and forth. Gregory told me this was actually a good sign because it meant the judge was taking Isabella's wishes seriously, but all I could think about was my 7-year-old daughter having to talk to a stranger about her trauma. Neil arrived 20 minutes later with Isabella holding his hand. She saw me and ran over. I knelt down and hugged her. I told her the judge wanted to talk to her for a few minutes, and she asked if I could come too. I said no, but Paul would be there with her. Isabella asked what the judge would ask, and I said probably just how she felt about things. I promised her she just needed to tell the truth. Paul came over and held out his hand. Isabella took it but looked back at me the whole way down the hall. They disappeared into the judge's chambers, and I stood there staring at the closed door. The 30 minutes felt like hours. I checked my phone every 2 minutes even though no time had passed. Finally, the door opened, and Isabella came running out crying. She crashed into me, and I picked her up. Paul walked over to Gregory and said something quietly. Gregory nodded and came to tell me that Isabella had clearly expressed her wishes to the judge. He said that was all Paul could share, but it seemed to go as well as it could. The judge called us back into the courtroom for closing arguments. My ex-wife's lawyer went first. He talked about second chances and redemption. He said Isabella's fear could be overcome with time and therapy. He claimed that denying a reformed mother access to her child was cruel and went against the spirit of family reunification. He said my ex-wife had served her time and done the work to become someone worthy of being a mother. He asked the judge to give her a chance to prove she'd changed. Gregory stood up for our closing, and his voice was steady and strong. He said Isabella's well-being had to be the priority above everything else. He talked about the severity of the abuse and the lasting trauma. He said my ex-wife's rehabilitation didn't erase the danger she posed to Isabella's psychological health. He described Isabella's panic attacks and regression and fear. He asked the judge to look at Isabella's artwork and Dr. Singh's evaluation and the therapist's testimony. He said all the evidence pointed to one conclusion. Contact with her mother was harmful, and Isabella needed protection. Gregory asked the judge to maintain current custody and suspend visitation until Isabella was old enough to consent to contact herself. He said that might be years from now or it might be never, but that decision should belong to Isabella when she was mature enough to make it. The judge thanked both lawyers and said she'd take the case under advisement. She said we'd receive a written ruling within 2 weeks. Everyone stood up as she left, and I felt completely empty inside. Outside the courthouse, I walked to my car with Gregory beside me. Isabella was waiting with Neil in the parking lot. I could see her little face pressed against the window of Neil's truck. Gregory put his hand on my shoulder and told me the judge's decision to take it under advisement was actually normal. He said 2 weeks wasn't a long wait compared to some cases. I thanked him and headed toward Neil's truck. Isabella jumped out before I even got there and ran to me. I picked her up and she wrapped her arms around my neck. She asked if it was over. I carried her to my car and buckled her into her seat. I told her the judge was deciding now and we'd know in 2 weeks. Isabella's eyes got big, and she asked what happens if the judge says she has to live with her mother. I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my voice steady. I promised her I'd fight any decision that wasn't safe for her. I had no idea what that would actually look like, but I couldn't let her see my fear. Neil came over and gave me a hug. He told me to call him if I needed anything. I drove home with Isabella quiet in the back seat. The next 2 weeks were the worst of my life. Every time my phone rang, I jumped. I checked the mail 3 times a day, even though Gregory said the ruling would come to his office first. I couldn't sleep more than a few hours each night. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. Isabella asked me every single day if we'd heard anything yet. I tried to act normal, but she could tell I was scared. We went through the motions of our regular routine, but everything felt wrong. A week into the wait, Gregory called me at work. My hands shook so bad I almost dropped my phone. He said the judge had requested more paperwork about Isabella's therapy progress. He told me this was actually a good sign, because it meant the judge was taking Isabella's trauma seriously. I wanted to believe him, but I'd learned that the system doesn't always protect children the way it should. I'd seen my ex-wife lie to police and almost get away with it. I'd watched her hurt my baby and only get 7 years. Why would this judge be different? On a Tuesday afternoon during the second week, my phone rang at work. It was Gregory. His voice sounded different, and he told me to sit down. I sat down at my desk and held my breath. Gregory said the ruling came in that morning. The judge awarded me sole legal and physical custody of Isabella. My ex-wife got no visitation rights until Isabella turns 13 and can ask for contact herself if she wants to. I couldn't breathe. Gregory kept talking and said the ruling talked about how bad the original abuse was. It mentioned Isabella's ongoing trauma and all the expert testimony about how contact with her mother was hurting her. He said my ex-wife could appeal the decision, but he thought the ruling was solid enough that an appeal probably wouldn't work. I thanked him about 5 times and hung up. Then I sat at my desk and cried. My coworkers stared at me, but I didn't care. We won. Isabella was safe. I left work early and drove to Isabella's school. I sat in the pickup line, shaking. When Isabella came out and saw me instead of her usual after-school sitter, she looked confused. I helped her into the car and told her we were going somewhere special. I drove to the park near our apartment. We walked to a bench under a big tree, and I sat down with her next to me. I told her the judge made a decision. I said the judge decided she doesn't have to see her mother anymore, and she's staying with me. Isabella didn't say anything for a long time. She just stared at the playground in front of us. Then she asked if I was sure. She asked if it was really over. I promised her it was really over. That's when she started crying. But these weren't scared tears or sad tears. These were the kind of tears that come when you've been holding your breath for months and finally get to breathe. I pulled her close and she buried her face in my shirt. We sat on that park bench holding each other while she cried. I felt 7 years of fear start to let go of my chest. Other families played on the playground, and I watched them while holding my daughter. For the first time since this whole custody fight started, I felt like maybe we'd actually be okay. The weeks after the ruling brought slow changes. Isabella's nightmares happened less and less. She stopped having panic attacks before school. Her teacher sent me an email saying Isabella was talking to her classmates again during lunch. She said Isabella's drawings went back to bright colors and happy scenes instead of the dark scribbles from before. Isabella's therapist told me in our next meeting that she saw big improvements. She said now that the threat of being forced to see her mother was gone, Isabella could actually start healing. The therapist still wanted Isabella to keep coming to therapy to work through the trauma from both the original abuse and the custody battle itself. I agreed, even though the cost made me want to cry. But Isabella was getting better, and that was worth everything. The money situation was brutal. I added up all the numbers one night after Isabella went to bed. I owed Neil $15,000. I owed Gregory and Sharon $20,000. My credit cards were maxed out at another $5,000. I was working every overtime shift my job would give me. I picked up weekend shifts. I stopped buying anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. But Isabella was safe, and that was worth any amount of debt. Neil called me one night and told me to stop worrying about paying him back. He said to give him whatever I could whenever I could. He said family helps family, and Isabella was family. Gregory and Sharon set up a payment plan that wouldn't kill me. $300 a month for the next 5 years. It was doable if I kept working overtime. Slowly, month by month, I started chipping away at what I owed. 6 months after the ruling, Isabella and I settled into a new normal. She was doing great in the school. Her teacher said she was one of the best students in the class. Isabella made some good friends and started getting invited to birthday parties. She almost never mentioned her mother anymore. We started having pizza nights every Friday where Isabella got to pick the toppings. We read together every single night before bed. She was working her way through a series about a girl who solves mysteries, and she loved it. Our apartment was small and kind of shabby. The carpet was old and stained. The walls needed paint. The kitchen was tiny, but it was ours, and it was safe. Nobody was coming to take Isabella away. I was exhausted all the time from working so much. I was broke and would be for years. I still had bad dreams sometimes about the custody hearing. But when Isabella hugged me and told me she loved me, none of that mattered. On a sunny Saturday morning, 6 months after the ruling, Isabella came into my room early. She asked if we could go to the park. Not just any park, but the specific park where I'd told her about the custody decision. We got dressed and walked there together. Isabella held my hand the whole way. We sat down on the same bench under the same tree. Isabella looked at me with her big brown eyes and said she wanted to thank me for fighting for her. I felt my throat get tight. I told her she never has to thank me for that. I said protecting her is what fathers do, and I'd do it 1,000 times over. She smiled and leaned against my shoulder. We sat there watching other families play on the playground. Kids ran around screaming and laughing. Parents pushed little ones on swings. A dad threw a ball with his son. I watched them and thought about everything we'd been through. The abuse, the arrest, the hospital, 7 years of rebuilding, the custody papers, the lawyers, the court dates, the fear, the debt, all of it. And I realized that despite everything, we made it. We were scarred, we were tired, but we were together and we were safe. Sometimes that's the best kind of victory there is.